Hello, I'm Matt Galloway, and this is the Current Podcast. Canada is getting ready to rearm. Ottawa wants that equipment and that gear to be made at home. Right now, that is largely not the case. A lot of Canada's military dollars are spent in the United States, but Canada is about to pour billions of dollars into defense. The aim is to meet new threats in a world where allies can no longer lean on the United States. Here's part of what the Prime Minister, Mark Carney, had to say as he launched his new defense investment strategy last week.
The truth is, over the last few decades, Canada has neither spent enough on our defence nor invested enough in our defence industries. We've relied too heavily on our geography and others to protect us. And this has created vulnerabilities that we can no longer afford and dependencies that we can no longer sustain.
Many in the defense industry are welcoming this opportunity. Bernard Mills is Executive Vice President of Defense of Kraken Robotics. It is a marine technology company founded in Newfoundland. He's in Halifax this morning. Bernard, good morning.
Good morning, Matt.
We heard the Prime Minister talk about vulnerabilities. What does your company make that could that could help Canada be less vulnerable, I suppose?
Absolutely. So our company was founded in Newfoundland, Canada, although it has now grown to around 500 people based in 7 countries around the world. We focus on the underwater battle space and underwater security, primarily in 2 ways. The first one is that we do imaging and surveillance using acoustic techniques, using optical techniques to make sure that critical infrastructure is secure, ports, cables, data pipelines, etc. And the second one is that we provide power systems that go into some of the new emerging underwater drones, autonomous vehicles that provide national security for our navies.
90% of your sales are to overseas customers. Why not here in Canada?
That's a long story, to be honest, I think, and it's actually a reason why at Kraken we really are encouraged and celebrate the launch of the Defence Industrial Strategy. We actually do have product in 30 countries around the world. And the frustrating thing in the past is that that doesn't mean that we haven't had strong linkages with Canadian research agencies and the Royal Canadian Navy. It's just that the bridge between doing early stage development of technologies, particularly in undersea surveillance in the Arctic and in other areas of Canadian interest, that early stage research and collaboration is not necessarily bridged into the major procurements that have eventuated with the Canadian government. That's not to say that they haven't happened at all. We did, about 2 years ago, win our first major contract with Canada, but it's still a minority compared to the work that we do in other countries in the world.
Will you be bidding now on contracts here, do you think?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that the DIS really gives that catalyst and gives that mandate for culture change in the conversation between Canadian governmental agencies and Canadian defence and security industry so that we can actually see Canadian technologies, and there are world-class technologies in this country, be adopted at a larger scale and brought into service by the Canadian Armed Forces.
This DIS, the Defence Investment Strategy, the Prime Minister says will create something like 125,000 jobs over the next decade. If your company were to win contracts here, do you think you would need to, or would you want to, hire people here in Canada to help further your technology and get it into Canadian hands?
Oh, absolutely. And actually, I think that the skilling and infrastructure piece is probably what keeps most defence industry executives up at night. When I think about how industry needs to respond to the DIS, there are really 3 things in my mind. First of all, we need to make sure whether we are Canadian companies based in Canada like Kraken is, or whether we are major subsidiaries of foreign companies. We need to make sure, first of all, that we have the right people to have the right conversations in Canada so that we create technologies and equipment that are best suited to the CAF. The second one is that we don't just want to have companies that do cookie cutter technologies that are imported from elsewhere. We want to design things. We want to manufacture things here in Canada that can then actually be relevant for the rest of the world. But then coming to your question, the third one is it's not good enough just to raise project teams in the short term that then dissipate for single projects. What we want is those long-term projects so that there is almost a generational building of skills and infrastructure in Canada that can be used to strengthen the country and make us less reliant and less dependent on other nations around the world.
To that point, and just very briefly, we're out of time, but the Prime Minister has said he wants to see, 70% of Ottawa's defence spending go to Canadian firms within a decade. Is something like that possible, do you think?
Look, I really applaud what the Prime Minister has said. I think, again, that there needs to be a cultural reset in the conversation between industry and the government. And I think putting an ambitious target like that out there actually means that it cannot be business as usual. As you can probably hear by my accent, I've seen that level of shift in Australia in my career, and I think Canada can do it. But whether or not it does it within the time frame is almost irrelevant. The relevant part is that we need a reset. We need to realise that incremental movement, timid movement, is no longer what's required. We really need to become a country that is self-reliant and that focuses on the amazing technologies that we have here and brings them to market in a significant way.
Bernard, good to talk to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bernard Mills is Executive Vice President of Defence of the marine technology firm Kraken Robotics. He was in Halifax. David Perry is President of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute think tank. David, good morning to you.
Good morning.
Pick up on what Bernard was talking about, this idea of 70% of Ottawa's defence spending going to Canadian firms within a decade. This is a big, ambitious plan. Is it doable?
It's absolutely doable, but it's going to require an awful lot of work. I think your previous guest was being very diplomatic there about why he sells far more abroad than he does domestically. It's a very common story that you hear from a lot of Canadian companies.
What's the non-diplomatic answer to that?
The government of Canada has previously not put any priority on buying Canadian.
And why would that be the case?
There's a host of different reasons. I think a lot of it has to do with wanting to get equipment that works seamlessly with Canada's allies, largely American allies. And so a lot of the policy direction that the armed forces have, which hasn't actually changed yet, incidentally, as a result of this new strategy, is that the forces are to be as interoperable with colleagues abroad as possible. And that's largely American. And that is in part driven a lot of the preference for buying gear based on U.S. design or made in the United States.
The F-35 would be an example of that, right? These fighter jets that are created by the United States. Canada's in the process of buying them. If you want a plan that's meant to reduce dependency on the United States, what does the story of the F-35 tell you?
So I think that's a perfect example to show that. And look, I think what the government has published here with the Defense Industrial Strategy is a really sound document. It's an overdue correction pointed in the right direction. It's very comprehensive. But part of this is going to have to be matched with new defense policy. This is the industrial part. You need the policy direction to national defense that would give better or at least more nuanced guidance about where the government of Canada wants our armed forces to be interoperable. Because part of the reason that the Air Force keeps saying the F-35 is the best choice is not just that it's the best airplane, but it's the one that is most interoperable with their key allied partners, the United States Air Force.
Does the Canadian military necessarily want gear that is produced here in Canada? Again, this speaks to the broader picture that you're talking about, but that seems to be one of the key issues here as well.
I think a lot of it depends. And I think the other important context to this is that the government is doing this with a much increased rate of defense spending. So in the past, part of the reason why the armed forces had I think a preference, honestly, for buying offshore was they didn't have enough money to go around. And the way to maximize the dollars that they had was to have it be tagged onto bigger purchases being made elsewhere and get some economies of scale. But if the government's making really significant additional investments in Canadian defense, then there's room to have more latitude in that and have some of those dollars go into what's essentially the research and development and engineering work to create more products in Canada that can fulfill the jobs for the armed forces. And I think that's absolutely doable. But I think as the document itself lays out, in some cases, this is going to take more time and more money to get those Canadian products up to a standard that our military needs. And
does the defense industry have the capacity to fulfill the defense needs of this country?
I think it definitely has a capacity to take up a bigger share of those defense needs. And I think, to be clear, 70%, there's lots of different ways that you can count spending. The Armed Forces buys everything from fighter jets to contracts to cut grass. So qualifying exactly what's going to be counted in that bucket will be, I think, pretty interesting to see what happens. And I think the other thing to keep in mind is, even if we're going to spend 70% of those dollars in Canada, still going to have very consequential purchases go other places, because we haven't made, as an example, go back to fighter jets. We haven't made fighter jets in more than half a century.
You also have a U.S. president who could respond poorly if we suddenly decide that some of our money is not going to go into the United States. That complicates things as well, right?
Everything with the American president is complicated. I think this is just one other aspect. I do think the document does, I think, rightly recognize that our defense relationship with the United States is extremely important. For the Canadian defense industry, it is the single largest export market and accounts for basically a third of every dollar of revenue earned. So I think maintaining the relationship with the United States, both in a wider defense sense, but in a defense commercial and industrial cooperation sense, is a key thing that I hope the government turns some attention to.
But your sense is broadly, this is, an ambitious idea, but also an idea that can be followed up on, that we could actually see some success out of this.
Yeah, I absolutely think that we can. I think we just need to be recognizing that it's going to take a significant investment of money, a significant investment of human capital, because a lot of what has to change fundamentally to make this strategy come to fruition is a change in mindset in Ottawa. We have not been working on the basis that we should default to buying Canadian first for generations. And I think if I had to underscore one point in this strategy that I take away from the Carney government, is basically like, where it makes sense to, we will buy Canadian. That has not been our historical practice.
David, good to talk to you as always. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
David Perry, president of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute think tank. He was in Ottawa. Erin O'Toole is the former leader of the Conservative Party of Canada. He's a veteran of the Canadian Armed Forces, also a distinguished fellow specializing in international trade at the Hudson Institute, and he's with me in studio. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Matt.
What do you make of this plan?
I think it's a good first step. The defense industrial strategy is something Canada's needed for some time, and the rupture the Prime Minister talked about in his famous Davos speech shows why we can't rely on the United States. We became lazy relying on the United States for our national defense, for our sovereignty, and we're going to have to do a lot more ourselves and do a lot more with new allies, our allies in NATO and Europe. So I do think the plan has some ambition to it. Build, partner, buy. We're going to build first. So Canada first, build that industry as David and Bernard, your guest, showed. And what is great, Matt, we have been innovators. We were the first to have an autonomous drone. That was an early Bombardier development. Now look at how important drones are. We were the first to have an autonomous subsurface drone as well, out of a business in British Columbia before Kraken. Kraken, who you spoke to earlier, is a world leader in this autonomy under the ocean. Well, we've got more coastline than any other country in the world, Matt. So we should be getting some of their technology into our Arctic. So I think there's great potential. There's a plan now. There's a commitment for the long term. And that will also let private industry invest their money to complement what the government is doing.
Well, we'll show you that the mindset is different, such that companies like Kraken don't sell 90% of their gear elsewhere. That's what, whether David says he's being polite or not, that's kind of at the heart of what's going on here, right? That we haven't thought about it in that way.
David's comment about changing the mindset is 100% right. We didn't have the mindset of making sure we had our own capacity to do these things. And for decades, it didn't seem like we needed to. The Americans were not just our ally, our friend, our neighbor. We leaned on them, and increasingly we leaned on them way too much. But I used to talk about this during the pandemic, Matt. When the crisis hit, we couldn't even get N95 masks that were made in Michigan sent to Windsor. You could have delivered them by bicycle. But when there's a crisis, whether it's food security, whether it's a health crisis, whether it's war or strife like we're seeing in Mexico, you have to be able to count on yourself first. And Canada has tremendous capability, but we haven't had that self-reliance since World War II, really. So we're rebuilding that. I think this DIS document is a good first step.
Well, what will show you that the mindset has changed? Again, Bernard talked about how the timid, idea is no longer required. That we have to think much more aggressively and boldly. What will show you that that's actually happening?
Well, we need purchase orders. So right now there's been studies, there's been new agencies. So Prime Minister Carney likes to create new agencies to do what old agencies weren't doing. That has me worried because we're falling into the Ottawa bubble trap. The thing that will show industry that they need to invest more and that Kraken can hire more people in St. John's, Newfoundland, is purchase orders. So we need to start showing that we're going to walk the talk and buying Canadian. And so this buy Canadian, this build component of their platform, saying 70% of what they spend. And Matt, by 2035, this is hundreds of billions of dollars over the next decade. They need to start this now to show people that they're serious, because I do a lot of work in Europe, and a lot of people are saying, well, what about if the midterm elections clip Trump's wings? Canada will not spend any of this. A lot of people don't believe we're actually going to follow through. Really? So if the government actually starts showing that seriously, they've done that a little bit. They bought some aircraft from Bombardier to replace the aging Challenger jet. But they have to do this across the board and make sure it's not just Bombardier CAE. We have a couple of world-class companies. We need to develop the ecosystem beneath them and have our own supply chain.
Let me just ask you in the couple of minutes that we have the political question here, which is, you've hinted at this. This is going to cost a lot of money. This is a significant investment. And that's money that presumably Ottawa won't spend on other things. Do you think Canadians are prepared for that?
This is a really big decision that Canadians have to realize, that these investments are needed because we can no longer rely on the old structures, the rules-based order.
Do you think the Canadians believe that? One of the reasons why the military was chronically underfunded was because funding it was not a political vote-getter for a lot of people.
You're right. It will change, voters' mindsets. But if you look at some of the polling, Matt, Canadians are worried about the U.S. I just read in the Globe this morning, they see the U.S. as a risk. A majority of Canadians, almost a super majority, they know we can't rely on that. So polling seems to show that they're willing to spend a lot more on defense.
Polling is one thing. When money is not going into the thing that you want it to be spent on, though, whether it's healthcare or there's a long list of everybody wants a piece of that pie. When it's not going to that and it's going to this, how do you make that case?
Well, going back to, I'm praising Mark Carney too much these days, but the build, baby, build mindset that he brought in, we have to leverage our resource wealth. We were leaving parts of our economy, Matt, on the sideline for far too long. And if we are going to build this sovereign capability, this capacity, if we're going to have more presence in the Arctic at a time where other countries are just going to ignore our sovereignty unless we're up there more, this will require spending. It will require decisions. But if we're also growing parts of our economy that were not really supported under Mr. Trudeau, that gives us flexibility. But the government will have to make tough decisions. This is a priority. Safety and national defense, these are things we never had to consider as fundamental, and they are fundamental in this world of rupture, as the Prime Minister outlined.
I have to let you go, but do you worry that maybe your friends in Europe are right? That if the midterms in November don't go the Republican way and Donald Trump's way, that the stomach for those big decisions perhaps may not be there in Ottawa?
I tell everyone that we've seen the world change, and we cannot allow short-term decision-making to change the fact that Canada needs to be more self-reliant. So even under the Biden administration, we weren't getting a lot of policies that were favorable to Canada. We have to be able to build up a lot of capacity for national defense, for sovereignty ourselves, and we have the ability. We are great innovators, Matt. We've just never bought enough from ourselves to justify these countries doing more at home. Now we need to. This is the first step. Let's get it done.
Erin, thank you.
Thank you, Matt.
Erin O'Toole is a veteran, former leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, distinguished fellow specializing in international trade at the Hudson Institute. He was with me in our Toronto studio. Your thoughts on this, and again, those tough decisions that are to come. We'd love to hear from you on that. You can email us, thecurrent@cbc.ca. You've been listening to The Current podcast. My name is Matt Galloway. Thanks for listening. I'll talk to you soon.